Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to address you again. It's also quite humbling to stand here to see you looking down. I think that's actually appropriate because we have to be held accountable. We are trying to give talks. So this is the title of my talk. Now, what I want to state is that my talk is an attempt to provide you with a theory in context approach. And as it says, all the theories that we use, and in this particular case, we use to analyze and assess immigrant integration, they rest on certain types of assumptions. And these are about principles, values, actors, structures, institutions, cultures. And of course, the selection of theory, whichever theory we take as a basis for our assessment, means also a selection of selection of the types of principles, values, actors, and structures that we will emphasize. Theory is always a selection in that sense. So it's not random, and it's very important, the type of starting point that we take, and the types of assumptions that underpin the theories. And of course, the context within which immigrant integration are taking place, they shape and condition the theoretical assumptions. And the context, of course, they are dynamic, they change. And therefore, that has a bearing also on the types of assumptions and our theorizing. And what I also want to point out is that theories may not travel well from one context to another. I'll give you some examples of that. So my approach is therefore not a normative approach, which you might have thought from the initial title of the talk, but it's much more of a political talk. It is an attempt to situate theories in context, to say something about the political and social conditions surrounding their functioning and their relevance. And therefore, I'm also bringing in new developments to position this in a broader political landscape. That's also what this book, incidentally, was trying to do. It started out from a project we had called Recode, and that was reconsidering complex diversity in the European Union and Canada. And as we were summing up and publishing and so on, we found, of course, that the world had changed. We suddenly were seeing a significant upsurge in right-wing populism, especially, with very important implications for the countries, the cases that we were studying. And we thought we cannot actually produce a book now on immigrant integration if we don't also include this type of perspective, because it has a very significant bearing on the conditions under which immigrant integration is taking place. So the book contains also this, and I will also include that in this talk, because I think it's a necessary aspect to bring in. Now, so that actually informs the fact that there are, I think, two key developments. And the first one is the one we have been discussing for a long time, the globalization and transnationalization, bringing states and societies more closely together and making them more interdependent. And also what Ulrich Beck was saying was that societies that are more closely linked together become more aware of themselves, but they can also therefore become more aware of their differences. So it's not necessarily so that this is a smooth and harmonious process of bringing people together, but it can also actually amplify differences among people. So the question therefore is, do these developments make them more open and inclusive for immigrants? The first one, the fact that they are actually brought together and people see that they are linked together. Brexit, of course, is a wonderful example to show how societies are interlinked, and that people who want to stake out their own course are realizing all the limitations that are embedded in this, in the current European setting, which has been designed to link societies together quite closely. But it comes with a number of different factors and implications. At the same time, we also have what a lot of people are saying, a kind of reaction. I'm not sure, but it probably could be. In any case, the rise of what I would call an ethnic nationalism that is bent on fostering national uniformity. That also comes with a specific conception of how to deal with immigrants, of course, or how not to deal with. But of course the question is, to what extent is this specifically about excluding the others, and what are the others in this case? And would all immigrants necessarily be considered others? And in the European case, this is interesting because you have multiple layers of people coming. You have people from other European states that have rights under European citizenship provisions, and then you have people from other parts of the world. And again, the UK case is interesting because of the Commonwealth dimension, which has given Commonwealth citizens significant rights in UK society. So you have a multi-layered structure here also of so-called immigrants. In fact, the UK debate is quite distorted because they call European citizens immigrants. They try to label them in the same group. Many of the Brexiters try to label them in the same group as people from other parts of the world. But I mean, legally speaking, they are not part of the same. So there's also this type of labeling process going on. In any case, there are two key developments that we are facing, I think, that we need to take into consideration. And in this, it is, since my talk is political institutional, I'm interested in the nation-state framework, and that's what this book was basically trying to discuss, whether that framework, whether the transformations we are seeing are taking place within that framework. And I'm not only now talking about institutions, but also the concepts we use to analyze and to construct reality, okay? So it's a conceptual as well as an empirical and practical context. So the concepts we use to understand community and identity and so on, and the actual lived experience. Those are the things that are part of the nation-state framework in this case. So the question, of course, is to what extent that framework itself is part of the transformation. The first development we saw, the globalization, transnationalization, was precisely saying this. The end of the nation-state, the transformation of the nation-state. This was the theme that was being investigated under the first one. The reaction seems to be bringing back kind of national. So the question, of course, is that framework itself a part of the transformation? At the same time, we also have this important challenge of methodological nationalism. We see that in the way in which our societies and our imaginations are constructed, broadly speaking, including in the statistical development. I mean, statistics is not innocent. This is about the social construction of society and the delineation of society along different types of statistical parameters, and the nation-state has been the fundamental container for getting data on people. So all the parameters have many of the parameters of our societies have been configured along nation-state lines. And much of our thinking about community and so on have been configured along the nation-state framework. And if you take that for granted without questioning this as a premise, then that has very significant bearing on how you understand society and the theories that you use. That's the idea behind this methodological nationalism. And especially the last sentence there from Wimmer and Glick-Schiller conflates national interest with the purposes of social science. So that sometimes social scientists must be aware of the fact that they are actually also promoting particular political projects. And that's a very important aspect. So I'm not in any sense denigrating the nation state. I'm simply saying that it has become such a taken for granted frame of reference when it should be questioned sometimes. And we need to know when to question and when not to question it. So I start this by giving this table that I've concocted. That's not in the book, by the way. But what I do is I use Albert Hirschman, his idea of exit voice loyalty, but I add a Roccan entry category. And I do that because I want to unpack the nation state as a configuration. So what I do, these two first, exit and entry, are about the state, the territory, bordering, the control of territory by the organization of the state. The state regulates who exits and who enters the territory. That's about borders. borders can be more or less permeable, more or less open. This is about the ability to express your sentiments and your discontents. For immigrants, this is an important issue. To what extent they are entitled. This is the broader understanding of this is, of course, democracy. The ability to shape the community within which you live. Loyalty is an outcome, has to do with a communal belonging. To what extent you feel an attachment and ultimately are willing to die for the nation. I mean, this is the ultimate loyalty, to die for the nation, la patria. So the idea here is that how you regulate these by the state has very significant implications for the ability to foster loyalty and the conditions under which there is voice. Okay? So there's a causal implication also built into this, that these are scope conditions for regulating and shaping loyalty. So this is actually an institutional theory behind this, in terms of thinking about how states shape nations, how institutions shape nations, and the conditions under which people live. It's from there that I start to disentangle. So this is actually, this itself is a theory, okay? These categories can be used to assess all the different perspectives that we're talking about. And then this is the operationalization, the specification of these conditions. And that can be done much better than I've done here, but I've given you illustrations. So, of course, with immigration, this is the most relevant factor, entry. Now, of course, I also include ideas and values in this, because the liberal system will be open to ideas and values. China doesn't in terms of internet. It regulates the import of ideas and so forth through the internet. Totalitarian systems regulate this. Open liberal societies do not. They, of course, also regulate who comes in. And, of course, our modern societies are based on the regulation of individuals, the movements. And there are significant limitations to how, or the extent to which groups can enter in modern societies. And what should also be kept in mind is that in the modern state has despite globalization, the modern state has much more developed technological means for border controls than have ever existed before. So the system of border controls are actually more developed now, despite the fact that societies have become more global. So there are some paradoxes in this. 100 or so years ago, people didn't even have passports. Now, even if you are in Schengen, the hotel will normally ask you for your passport. So, I mean, the surveillance system and so on are much more developed now than they are. So there are some paradoxes in this. In any case, the regulation, especially of individuals, very specific requirements depending on what kind of status that people have, what status they want to obtain and so forth, vary on this. But this is the basic category of individuals. The possibility also of territorial entry, but of course in a system of states, the threshold here is very high. You don't normally have easy transfers that, for instance, part of Norway would like to go to Sweden, maybe, but neither state would actually allow it, you know. So, I mean, that threshold is quite high. So, in any case, this entry regulation is very much there. And it is so that it singles out individuals. People in terms of immigrants are individuals coming. Sometimes asylum seekers would come from certain places, but they're still being treated as individuals, not as groups. So there is an individualization in terms of the nation-state's entry component. In terms of export, well, about ideas and so on, again, this system is open for persons. No collective or territorial exit, as you see in Catalonia and so far in the UK. And there's also a limited exit from the past, in a sense that, I mean, this is a very different way. This is an emotional way, but it has to do about reminding people of the past. This is very much part of the national story, the ability to foster loyalty. And then on loyalty, the state has instruments to foster loyalty. Socialization, education systems, military conscription, and so on. All these things are there to foster loyalty and and belonging in a society. And of course also social rights, entitlements that tie people to the community. So this is a particular type of configuration. Along these lines, if we disentangle this more closely, we would see and apply this even more specifically to immigrants. You will see that this has a very specific shape. So this is the standard master narrative from the nation state. Now, one of the things that Schiller especially has underlined is that the transnational element of nation building has been greatly underestimated because of methodological nationalism. Also, the cosmopolitan experience people have, that a lot of people live cosmopolitan lives, has been downplayed in this master narrative notion. And that there also are a number of principles that are quite universalist in our own political systems, in our democratic constitutionalism. At the same time, the master narrative itself is challenged from within by this new ethnic forms of nationalism. And by broader developments, globalization, and so on. So, I mean, we see some of the biases that this master narrative of the nation state has given us, and the fact that there is a challenge going on. Now, the first theory people would use then to think that that represents a challenge in some ways is multiculturalism. I think this has been a lot of the debate in Europe. I think that in the basic understanding of multiculturalism is that it's a difference-sensitive approach to immigrant integration that nevertheless has a center of gravity of the recipient state. It is mainly about how the state that receives immigrants is incorporating them, how it relates to them, how it treats them, whether that state recognizes certain features of these people or not. So I think this is within the standard nation-state framework. Even multicultural citizenship, that we have to include and open up this to groups. It's not really a departure from the nation-state. It's rather that the nation-state should also recognize the group affiliation of people, that they belong to certain types of groups. So I don't think actually this is something that deeply challenges this, especially if you look at its origins in Canada, which has a kind of open liberal nationalism. What many people in Europe don't know is that multiculturalism in Canada was not about Quebec, nationalism in Quebec. It was not about Aboriginals. They were pursuing a nationalist course. Multiculturalism in Canada emerged among the European immigrants to Canada in basically the prairies and so on, who saw themselves as second status people because you had two founding nations, the French-speaking and the English-speaking. The so-called allophones, the people who don't speak, whose original language was neither French nor English, wanted recognition. And they pushed for a multiculturalism. That is, that the society should be open to other cultural experiences, and these should also be valued. So that was the origins of the multiculturalism theory in Canada. And this was part of their struggle for recognition as equal, culturally speaking, citizens in the Canadian context. So this is a much more inclusive understanding overall. That is a question of modifying the notion of citizenship, but it's not a question of changing the basic parameters of immigrant inclusion. This is my thesis. Not in the Canadian context. In the European, it was the export of this to Europe has not been very successful because it has been seen as a much more divisive. And doctrine and people have seen and understood theory, cultures much more in essentialist terms and much more as a part, and therefore this has been seen almost as a recipe for a kind of cultural ghettoization in many European states. That was not the intention in the Canadian case. It was quite a different, it was a much more integrative understanding of different cultures with symbolic recognition of cultures and so on without really fundamentally changing the structure of society. And the rhetoric in Europe has not been that. It has been much more dismissive of this and said that, oh, this is really about fragmenting societies. So it shows you that a theory can be reinterpreted quite significantly in a different context from where it was originating. So it served one purpose in this place and it was distorted and is said to be serving a very different purpose in another place. The other theory that has come up is transnationalism. Now this one is much more in line with this first challenge that I spoke about, the transnationalization. Of course, in a European context, we have to keep in mind that there are two sets of transnational developments. One is driven by the European integration and the development of the mobility rights in European citizenship. That's a supranational form. The other one is a much more networked form and much more specific to the immigrant's own experience. And this especially Riva Castoriano has been doing work on this. And what she is underlining is precisely the relation between home and host state in terms of the immigrant experience. That this is a structured relationship and it is fundamentally important. It doesn't disappear even if somebody emigrates. If you leave your home state to go to the host state, there is still a relation between them. So you have to understand this type of the immigrant's experience in the interaction between home and host state, where the immigrant also plays a fundamental role in between. And that the identity of the immigrants is shaped by this in-betweenness. Because this is a more fixed state in these networks. People are developing identities in these networks, is the claim. So here you are no longer inside the master narrative, the nation-state framework, but you are looking at relations between states, structured relations, where home states will make a plea to loyalty to the immigrants. They say that you have to show loyalty to your home state even if you have emigrated. You should have multiple citizenship and you should exhibit this. So there are political programs of ensuring that the immigrants stay loyal to the place they left. At the same time, the host state also wants these people to be loyal, to develop attachments. So this is a much more dynamic relationship between home and host state. So here you see also the difference with multiculturalism, which focuses mainly on the receiving state, the concerns of the receiving state. Doesn't think about this transnational dimension. This is actually left behind once you enter the new state. But that's actually not the reality of people. They mediate between these different contexts. So therefore, the political dimension here is important. And as you can understand, this operates on quite a different constellation of exit, entry, voice, loyalty, because we are no longer in one state, but we are in between states. And they have their own regulations, and they have their own intention to foster loyalty in people. So this is quite a different situation than from the initial national meta-narrative. And then we go on to cosmopolitanism, which of course is also a political doctrine. It's much more than about immigrant integration, but it also has been thought about in terms of immigrant integration. And of course, much more about moral universalism than about recognition of difference and diversity. However, there has been a whole debate about where to strike the balance within the cosmopolitan debate. And again, this relies on a different constellation, and I'll show this quickly. That here, of course, the whole idea of cosmopolitanism presupposes a very different political configuration than the nation state, with much lower barriers to exit and especially entry for our purposes, with much weaker mechanisms for instilling loyalty, and of course, the idea of reflexivity and openness to question always, to challenge authority and so forth. So this is a very different one, which is based on a much weaker notion of loyalty and much weaker mechanisms for ensuring loyalty than you have in the nation-state configuration. Because the scope conditions are supposed to be very different. Okay, I will jump this because I'm running out of time. I'd rather do the reactions. So this is the other development we saw. The new or ethnic nationalism. And that's a challenge to the civic nationalism, to the meta-narrative we saw. And the question, of course, is how much of a challenge is it? Well, if we run through the scheme that I devised, these four categories, exit, entry, voice, loyalty, it is as much ensuring exit or preventing people from coming in. In fact, and specific conditions regulating, especially the entry. And also limiting voice sometimes, also undercutting legal protections, sometimes under the radar in a number of states, and curtailing opposition, as we see in Hungary. And also a strong emphasis on ensuring loyalty, citizenship oaths and all these things that people have to go through and show a type of proficiency, understanding of society and so on, often with an ethnic twist, by the way. Cultural canons in Denmark and so on. So this is, again, a very different configuration where these have tightened, the two scope conditions have been tightened and allowed the society to instill much more loyalty and by curtailing voice. So this is a different type of configuration that we are seeing. Now, of course, these populist forces, they posit themselves, they pretend to be the authentic expressions or emanations of a pre-political people. Of course, I think this is bullshit. They use the language of recognition strategically as a political weapon to carve out political space for themselves, while at the same time actively denying recognition to immigrants. So this has to do about the recognition struggle, but it is a reverse politics of recognition from the one we saw in Canada. So they're using the same emotional language as was being said earlier today, strategically, to pursue their own political objectives. But this is a much more profound, it's a normative language. It's a much more profound development, and it is politically very potent. So it's not so that politics has gone from facts to values, but it has to do about the political struggle using a value-laden language about shaming and blaming and denial of recognition and so forth in order to pursue political objectives. Other politicians are very careful about doing that because it's risky, because it pits people against each other, because these are about the fundamentals of society. And it can be extremely divisive when you have struggles for recognition going on. So I think the new nationalism is an ethnic form of nationalism that uses the us-them opposition, but it also uses that against people inside the state, the so-called political class and so on, the respectable politicians, in part of their political struggle. And for the established politicians, the challenge is, on the one hand, that they're being outed by the so-called outed by the populists,
and they risk losing the power of the state to shape their societies. No longer control of these exit, entry, loyalty, voice levers that the state has. And so some actually just adapt other policies, which we see across the board in many European states. They tighten policies and so on, and they adapt to the pressure. Otherwise, include them in the government, and I don't think this has been a very successful development. This is not a good cooptation. So the problem is that the new nationalism can actually, in Europe, can also be extended to the European level, in which case we're getting a double whammy, not only from the national but also from the European level, which will alter configurations and hold conditions for immigrant integration in a much more fundamental sense. I think that's, we will see with the European elections now how this works. Can I do 2 minutes on the conclusion or not?
Maybe 1 minute.
1 minute I'll do. Okay, so basically I think that very much of what we're seeing is still happening within the terms of the nation-state master narrative still. Even the debates on cosmopolitanism and transnationalism are still within the broad-speaking terms, but they are not. So not in conceptual terms, they're not necessarily total departure using some of the vocabulary. However, of course, we're talking about very different phenomena. I argued about the multiculturalism aspect. We have seen this type of transnationalism in Europe. We have seen the importance of the dynamic between home and host states in this. And the issue of state control, who controls the state, becomes a fundamentally important aspect in this. So that's why I was using the nation-state narrative, because I think very much at stake now is about who controls the state and who has the levers also to inculcate communities with the values, the type of nationalism that you get in this type of circumstance. And it's kind of ironic here that even if Europeans thought that the EU was a very good case for cosmopolitanism, I think Canada actually in many ways has a better merit track record on this. And I've run out of time. And then we are seeing the types of reactions. And I think actually, as I said, I think this is ultimately a question of the broader political identity context that we live in. Thank you.